Shut up and sit down.
Canberra, the nation's capital and a bureaucratic fairyland. It's the most un-Australian of all cities I've visited so far on the Big Lap. The planned city is broken up into several zones centred around Lake Burley-Griffin. It has a political sector on the southern banks, leaving the north side for private businesses in the city's CBD. The leafy suburbs close to the many embassies on the southern side house the privileged senior government employees. The more dense suburbs sprawling out to the north and south house the many white-collar working-class bureaucrats. It's considered some to be a modern planned city, although now over 100 years old has become fairly outdated. The city is designed around the lake and Capitol Hill, with many sterile monuments and a CBD full of empty buildings. There's little here not connected with the federal government. Its suburbs are intentionally isolated to prevent through traffic, even though that funnels all the traffic onto main roads that crisscross the city. The suburbs in the political zone have a fairly leafy green appearance and are comprised predominantly by freestanding houses on larger blocks, making them somewhat reminiscent of Sydney's Upper North Shore. The suburbs on the outskirts are mainly smaller houses and duplexes, which are squashed together around a retail centre. Many of the suburbs are separated by a nature reserve that generally follow creeks and the ridgelines, and were once pastoral properties that are now all deforested. This design creates a high reliance on cars, which has resulted in one of the worst public transport networks I've seen on all my travels. Most bus routes bypass the isolated suburbs, and the population need to walk a fair distance to the main roads to catch one. And on top of that, excluding the well-supported shared path walkway around the lake, the walkways and cycleways throughout the suburbs all fall foul of the same issue, as they look to have been implemented as an afterthought and run alongside the main roads, forcing pedestrians and cyclists to cross the traffic who are often travelling at 80 kilometres an hour. The rail and tram network don't really go anywhere, and I don't think the locals would entertain travelling on one with the general public anyhow. This city is full of bureaucratic contradictions, where on one hand they're all eco-warriors saving the planet who want to drive electric and hybrid vehicles but seem to refuse to use public transport. They have signs that say no push bikes, and then on the same post as say push bikes should ride on formed paths only. They cover their roofs with solar panels and surround themselves with trees, but have streets without footpaths and have such a high reliance on cars that their high schools have huge car parks. Canberra is a city without power stations, prisons or significant rural and manufacturing sectors. All these things seem to happen magically elsewhere. Canberra boasts having one of the lowest unemployment and personal crime rates in the country. But when wandering through Queanbeyan, it's painfully obvious that New South Wales building regulations allow for a greater density of living than the Australian Capital Territory does. Canberra has many freestanding homes and a number of very large apartment blocks, but there are very little three-storey buildings, whereas Queanbeyan allows for the cheaper built, higher dense apartments. And even though there seems to be price synchronisation between the state and territory with things like petrol and alcohol, the cheaper housing has exported the poor and the unemployed over the border. After a week of living the country life of an old man in the shed, I headed off for an easy 2-hour ride up the A1 to Bateman's Bay for lunch. There's not too much to say. Riding along the Great Dividing Range, the road snakes its way up the coast such that I no longer need to worry about squaring off my tyres. There's little traffic along this route, so I imagine most of the trucks between Sydney and Melbourne would run along the Hume Highway through Albany. Getting to Bateman's Bay, with a whole heap of restaurants and takeaway food to choose from, it did make me feel like I've well and truly returned to the outskirts of Sydney. The days of having little choice between a $7 meat pie or a chicken roll are all long behind me. Sitting on the foreshore and relaxing in the summer sun, with little more to do than to watch the seagulls try to pester for a free meal. The feeling that this trip is soon coming to an end really did start to sink in. Heading inland towards Canberra along the King's Highway that passed the Wonga National Park, where the road was surprisingly good. It's difficult for the cars to get past all the Karens on the road, but once I managed to get past them heading into Brandwood, I was all on my own until getting to the ACT border. The border is a bit underwhelming as I passed into the territory, then a sign said Queanbeyan was 15 kilometres ahead. So I soon popped back out of the ACT as Queanbeyan is still in New South Wales. Then I rode through a second unassuming border that headed into the nation's capital. Getting to my accommodation with plenty of time left in the day, I headed off for the nearest grocery store, and the first thing I noticed was that all the independent grocery stores outnumbered the major chains. Also, the return of the coin-locked trolleys, and the snooty cashier who pondered how poor I must have been since I didn't have $3 coins to unlock one. Living close to the political quarters, life is very different experience from many other Canberrans. It's very quiet. The neighbours return stray pets back to their homes, and peacocks can wander around the streets without a care. The local corner store tries to be an upmarket independent grocer, and the nearest takeaway restaurant is like a 20-minute drive away. It's good to get back to Sydney, where I managed to book the bike in for a major service with only a week's notice. The bike is surviving, and I'm trying to limit the revs to about 5,000 RPM, which is about half of the red line, just because I think the oil is so overdue to be changed. I last got the bike fully serviced when I was in the Sunshine Coast, with the last oil change in Adelaide, which now all feel like a lifetime ago. I'm going to cancel the Starlink service if I can't use it when I get back to Sydney. I'll double check that it all still works after being lugged right around Australia for 12 months on the back of a motorcycle. I'll also arrange to have my cracked screen on my phone replaced, as I should now be able to handle the 3 days without it. Riding down Timberler Road, one of the few country roads in the ACT, where the police pay such little attention that I found an intersection where the local hoons have done burnouts to the point of leaving tyre shrapnel melted into the road. I stopped and had a look, and several other motorists pulled over to see if I needed any assistance, and I told them that in all my travels around Australia I'd never seen an intersection this bad, only to be told that I should hold off claiming that this is the worst in the country until I see the intersection a bit further down the road. It's interesting, in South Australia the police are all too busy attending accidents to do anything else. In Victoria the police are too busy watching the footy to stop the riffraff from taking over. You don't want to run from the Tasmanian police because you're too afraid they'll hurt themselves. The New South Wales police only leave the police station if it's a favour for a friend. And now in the Australian Capital Territory, the federal police will only act if the media is involved, out of the fears that some politician will pick up the complaint. At the beginning of this journey, I would not have expected that the Queensland police are amongst the hard-working and most honest in the country. Spending 2 weeks in Canberra was a bit long, as there's little more than a whole heap of empty monuments to a country that is no way represented by this city. Both Sydney and Melbourne won when neither was decided to be the nation's capital. Canberra was designed to impress visiting foreign politicians and to convince Australians that this country is as good as America. Although the world's dominant superpower will at least attempt to enforce the rule of law, while all other countries, including Australia, are still run by a select group of inbreds, often referred to as the deep state. I am now 300 kilometres away from home and completing the big lap. It's been years in the planning and nearly a year in its execution. Now the moment that has been playing around my head all this time is nearly here. I put such an effort into achieving this goal that for the first time in years I'm not sure what I'll be doing in a couple of weeks. I'm curiously goalless for the first time since I was a teenager. With only a few hours left in the ride to get home, I'm now so familiar with the road that I should be able to get there on instinct alone. So here's hoping I don't suffer from performance anxiety and have a crash on the last hop. After following National Route 1 for all this time, I think I'll return to the coast for lunch at Shellharbour before heading up to Sydney through the Royal National Park. I plan to spend the next 4 weeks doing summary videos and trying to give you guys some of the lessons learnt and what I would have liked to have known when planning this journey in the beginning. So thanks for following my adventures around Australia. Remember to go out there and do something to enjoy your day.